The first wave had already failed. On the morning of June 6, 1944, D-Day, the beaches of Normandy were supposed to be the Allies' doorway back into Europe. But to the men trapped on the sand, it felt like a slaughterhouse. Machine gun fire ripped through the air. Mortar shells burst in the surf. Tanks bogged down and burned where they landed. The Germans had done their work well. Every stretch of beach was laced with mines, hidden beneath the sand, waiting for pressure. The first few tanks that tried to cross vanished in plumes of smoke and sand, their steel hulls flung into the air. Infantry froze. Commanders shouted for movement, but no one could move forward. The invasion was stalling before it had even begun. Then, through the smoke and chaos, came a sound no one expected. A deep, metallic whoomp, 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 echoing across the shoreline. Out of the mist rolled a tank unlike any other. A Sherman, with a strange rotating drum on its nose, chains whipping the ground ahead in a furious blur. Every few seconds, an explosion erupted beneath it, throwing sand and shrapnel skyward. But the tank kept advancing, steady, methodical, hammering a path through death itself. Soldiers stared in disbelief. One private muttered, "That thing's gone mad." Another yelled, "Follow it!" Behind the bizarre, flailing machine, men began to run. Through the cleared path it left behind, across ground that had been certain death only moments before. The tank's commander radioed back 2 words. "Path open." By midday, the beaches that had swallowed hundreds were giving way. The Allied armor began to roll inland. And it all started with a tank that most generals had once laughed at. A tank nicknamed the Crab. It looked ridiculous. It sounded insane. But it cleared 30 minefields in a single day and saved the greatest invasion in history. This is the story of the man who built it and the army of misfits who turned madness into victory. Before the war remembered him as a genius, the army dismissed him as a joke. His name was Percy Cleghorn Stanley Hobart, a man born into the traditions of the British officer class, but burdened with a mind that never stopped questioning. He'd been a cavalryman once. Polished boots, horses, sabers. Then came the tank, and Hobart saw what others didn't. He saw the future. In the interwar years, while most officers still dreamed of gallant charges and parade drills, Hobart was sketching machines, squat, ugly, and unstoppable. He studied engines, tracks, armor plates. He believed the tank wasn't just a weapon. It was a revolution. But revolutions make enemies, and Hobart had a way of offending all the right people. He was blunt, impatient, brilliant, but impossible. He argued in meetings, shouted at superiors, and refused to salute stupidity. In the conservative world of the British Army, that was suicide. By 1940, as German panzers swept across France, Hobart, the man who'd warned of their exact tactics years before, was quietly retired. Officially, he was too old-fashioned. Unofficially, he was too difficult. The army sent him home to command a home guard unit in the Midlands, a polite exile among pensioners and farmers. It should have been the end of him. But in war, talent has a way of resurfacing. Somewhere in London, Winston Churchill had been reading reports, and one file in particular stood out. It described a certain dismissed officer who had been right about everything the army had ignored. Churchill scribbled a single order in the margin. "Call Hobart back. We need men who think." When the summons arrived, Hobart thought it was a joke. It wasn't. Within days, he found himself face to face with the Prime Minister. Churchill puffed his cigar, eyed the aging officer, and said, "They tell me you're a difficult man." Hobart replied, "Only when I'm right, sir." Churchill grinned. "Good. Then let's see you prove it." And with that, the man the army had thrown away was given command of an experiment so strange, so improbable, that no one else would have dared touch it. It would be called the 79th Armored Division. Its mission: to build machines that could do what ordinary tanks never could, to fight with imagination. They gave Percy Hobart a handful of engineers, a few dozen tanks that should have been scrapped, and an empty airfield in southern England. What he built there looked less like a military unit and more like a carnival of lunatics. In the hangars, sparks flew day and night. Welders tore turrets off old Churchills and Shermans. Mechanics hammered plates into strange shapes. The air smelled of oil, cordite, and invention. Hobart stalked between workbenches with a notebook in one hand and a scowl in the other, muttering about machines that could think. What he wanted sounded impossible. Tanks that could swim, tanks that could climb, tanks that could clear mines or flamethrow their way through concrete. He called them specials. His soldiers called them funnies. And within weeks, that name stuck. Hobarts Funnies. The men he recruited were engineers, tinkerers, even artists. Many were soldiers who'd been passed over by the regular army. Too clever, too reckless, too different. Hobart loved them. They said we're the wrong kind of soldiers, he'd tell them, but we might just be the right kind of madmen. Each workshop became a theater of experimentation. One team built a tank that could launch bridges from its own back, the Churchill Ark. Another attached a massive pipe to spew liquid fire, the crocodile. And then there was the most absurd of them all, the crab. At first glance it looked ridiculous. A Sherman tank with a rotating drum bolted to its front, spinning heavy chains that smashed the ground as it moved. Each chain was meant to trigger mines before the tank reached them, a mechanical flail beating the earth into submission. When Hobart first saw the prototype, even he laughed. "It looks like something from a nightmare," he said. But when they tested it on a live minefield, the laughter stopped. The flail hit the ground, the mines exploded in perfect rhythm, and the tank kept moving. The crab worked. Crude, loud, terrifying. But it worked. Still, when news of Hobart's circus reached high command, the reaction was the same as before. "Absurd contraptions," one general scoffed. "The war will be over before they're ever needed." But Hobart ignored them. He knew war had a habit of punishing arrogance. He once told his men, "Let them laugh. They'll stop when our toys win the war." By the spring of 1943, Hobart's airfield of misfits had turned into a proving ground of miracles. Rows of tanks sat gleaming in the sunlight, each one stranger than the last, each one the punchline to a joke that no one was laughing at anymore. But talk was cheap. The time had come to prove that these machines could actually fight. The first tests were chaos. The bridge-laying tanks jammed halfway across the gap. The flamethrower crocodiles roasted their own cables. The amphibious tanks sank like stones. And the flail tanks, Hobart's beloved crabs, broke their chains faster than the crews could replace them. Commanders from London watched with folded arms, unimpressed. "Interesting toys," one muttered, "but hardly practical." Hobart didn't argue. He simply told his men, "Try again." And they did. Day after day, failure after failure, until the failures started turning into patterns, and the patterns turned into progress. The crab crews learned the rhythm of the machine, the precise speed that kept the flails striking evenly, detonating mines just ahead of the tracks. They adjusted the chain length, the drum weight, even the angle of the spin, until explosions became a metronome. Whoomp, whoomp, whoomp. The tank advanced. The mines blew harmlessly. The crew barely flinched. Soon, the flail tanks could clear a 16-foot-wide lane through a minefield faster than infantry could run it. A path for tanks, trucks, and men. Safe, reliable, repeatable. When Winston Churchill himself visited the test range, he arrived expecting a sideshow. He left in silence, his cigar half-smoked, eyes fixed on the smoking ground behind the crab. Turning to an aide, he said quietly, "It appears this absurd thing works." By summer, the War Office had stopped laughing. Hobart's Funnies were officially accepted, not as experiments, but as part of Britain's invasion plan. His once disgraced 79th Armored Division became the most unconventional and essential armored unit in the Allied Army. Hobart gathered his men that evening and told them the news. "They've finally noticed us," he said, a grin curling under his mustache. Now we'll give them something they'll never forget. And as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the strange tanks rumbled across the English fields, practicing for a battle no one yet knew the name of, but that the world would remember forever. By early 1944, the fields of southern England looked less like a training ground and more like the workshop of a mad inventor. Hobarts Funnies, his strange, ingenious tanks, were everywhere. Rows of Shermans and Churchills lined the countryside, their odd attachments jutting out like armor-plated wings. Soldiers on leave would stop and stare, laughing at the sight of tanks with whips, cages, rafts, and giant rollers. Hobart walked among them every morning with his clipboard tucked under one arm, inspecting each new design like a proud, impatient father. The machines had names now: Crocodile, Ark, Bobbin, AVRE, and of course, Crab. Each one built to solve a nightmare no ordinary tank could face. In secret hangars, units trained obsessively for a mission they weren't allowed to name. Crews practiced bridge laying in the dark. Crocodile teams tested their flamethrowers against concrete bunkers. Crab drivers learned to keep their flails spinning steady, even under machine gun fire. Over and over, Hobart drilled them until every man moved like clockwork. The secrecy was absolute. Officially, these tanks didn't exist. They were never photographed, never mentioned, never discussed outside the wire. The rest of the army had no idea what Hobart was preparing, or how much they would need him. Then, one night in April, the order finally came. The 79th Armored Division would not fight as a single unit. Instead, its funnies would be split up, attached to the British and Canadian landing forces heading for Normandy. When Hobart read the plan, he smiled grimly. "Good," he said. "Let's see if the world's ready for a little imagination." On the eve of D-Day, as soldiers wrote letters home and ships waited for the tides, Hobart stood on the cliffs of southern England watching the horizon. Below him, hundreds of landing craft bobbed in the dark, loaded with men and machines that looked like something from a dream. His officers joined him in silence. Somewhere out there, across that cold gray water, his machines would decide the fate of the greatest invasion in history. He turned to them and said quietly, "Tomorrow, gentlemen, they'll stop laughing." Dawn broke gray over Normandy. The sea was restless, the wind biting, and the horizon alive with steel. On board hundreds of landing craft, the men of the 79th Armored Division waited in silence beside their strange machines. Tanks that looked more like science fiction than war. Some prayed, some laughed nervously. Others stared straight ahead. Then came the order. "Go!" The ramp doors slammed open and chaos exploded. Mortar fire churned the surf into white foam. Machine guns stitched the water with lines of death. Tanks rolled forward, engines howling as waves slammed against their hulls. A few sank instantly, swallowed by the sea. The rest ground their way onto the sand, and into hell. Sword Beach, Juno, Gold. The British and Canadians had drawn the hardest defenses on the coast. Anti-tank obstacles littered the shoreline. Concrete bunkers poured fire, and behind it all lay the invisible enemy, the minefields. Dozens of Allied tanks hit them within minutes, vanishing in fireballs. The beach became a graveyard of metal. Infantry huddled behind wrecks, pinned by the storm of bullets. Commanders shouted for a path, any path. And then, through the smoke, came the sound. A low, rhythmic pounding. Whump, 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 growing louder with every second. Out of the haze rolled the Sherman Crab, its flail spinning in a wild blur, chains smashing the sand ahead like a giant drum. Each strike detonated a mine with a burst of flame and dust, but the tank kept moving, slow and steady, unfazed by the explosions tearing at its armor. Behind it, soldiers began to rise. They watched in disbelief as the Crab carved a perfect path through the minefield, a tunnel of safety through chaos. "Follow it!" someone yelled, and they did. Dozens of men, then hundreds, advancing behind the whirling tank as it beat the beach into submission. The Crabs worked in pairs, side by side, clearing lanes for other tanks and troops. Farther down the coast, the crocodiles roared to life, spraying liquid fire into enemy bunkers. AVREs smashed concrete walls with giant mortars, and arcs unfolded themselves into living bridges across shell craters. What had begun as a nightmare turned into a strange, brutal symphony. Medical lemmetal clanging, chains spinning, explosions bursting in rhythm. By noon, the impossible beach was open. The enemy's traps lay shattered beneath the waves. The invasion, the greatest gamble in history, was moving forward again. And at its center were the machines everyone had mocked. They looked absurd, they sounded insane, but they worked, and they saved thousands. By the time the sun dipped behind the smoke of Normandy, Hobart's so-called funnies had done the unthinkable. In less than 24 hours, they had cleared paths through more than 30 minefields, breached seawalls, flattened bunkers, and dragged whole divisions off the beaches. Reports came in over crackling radios, calm voices reciting miracles. Minefield cleared at sword, troops advancing. Gold secure, 2 crabs lost, lanes open. Juno complete, infantry moving inland. In operations rooms across the channel, officers crowded around the maps in disbelief. The impossible defenses of Hitler's Atlantic Wall were falling, not to overwhelming numbers, but to a handful of bizarre, handmade machines and the crews who refused to quit. The Sherman Crabs moved like clockwork, each flail pounding the ground in perfect rhythm, detonating one mine after another, while the tanks behind followed their cleared trails. Crews inside barely spoke. The explosions were so close, each one rattled their bones, the air thick with dust and cordite. But they trusted their machines. To outsiders, the beach looked like madness. Spinning chains, geysers of sand, roaring engines. To the men inside, it was music. Each explosion meant another few feet of safety. Another life spared. Another bridgehead opened. Behind them, the crocodiles pressed forward, their flamethrowers clearing bunkers that had resisted for hours. The arcs unfolded into bridges where craters had swallowed entire vehicles. The bobbins rolled out thick carpets across the mud so trucks could pass. Every invention, every funny idea, was earning its place in history. At one point, a young lieutenant radioed back to headquarters. "Sir, the enemy's retreating. They can't believe what they're seeing." By dusk, Allied armor was rolling miles inland. What the High Command had predicted would take days had taken hours. Hobart's oddities, the tanks no one wanted, had torn the spine out of Hitler's coastal defense in a single afternoon. Later, when an officer asked how many minefields the Crabs had cleared, one of the flail drivers laughed through the static. "I stopped counting after 30, sir. The rest were just noise." And for the first time in the entire war, that noise, the relentless pounding of explosions, meant hope. When the news reached England, Percy Hobart didn't celebrate. He simply sat in his small office at headquarters, listening to the radio reports as his machines rolled through Normandy. Every few minutes, a new transmission came in. One bridge secured, one beach cleared, one town liberated. For the man once cast out of the army as a failure, it was more than vindication. It was redemption. 3 years earlier, he'd been laughed at, dismissed, and forgotten. Now, the world's most powerful armies were winning with his machines. Generals who had called him a dreamer now called him a genius. Soldiers who'd mocked the funnies were now begging for more. But Hobart didn't care for glory. He cared that his men had survived. He knew what those reports didn't say. The crabs that never came back. The crews burned alive when a flail hit 2 mines at once. The engineers who built bridges under fire until their hands bled. His inventions worked, but they had cost lives, and he felt each one of them. When he finally visited France weeks later, he walked along a stretch of beach still littered with wrecks and twisted steel. Among them lay one of his crabs, half buried in sand, its flail drum still frozen mid-spin. The paint had blistered away, but its name was still visible. Matilda's Revenge. Hobart rested his hand on the scorched hull, his uniform sleeve brushing against rust. A young corporal nearby recognized him and saluted. "Sir, your funnies saved us that morning," the soldier said. "We'd have never made it off the beach without them." Hobart looked out toward the gray sea and answered quietly, "You saved yourselves, son. We just built the tools." That night, he sat with his officers around a campfire. They laughed softly about the early days, the broken prototypes, the generals who said no, the nicknames that had stuck. But in the silence that followed, Hobart said something they would never forget. "It doesn't matter that they laughed at us. What matters is that they're alive to laugh now." He was right. His machines had cleared the way for liberation, and his reputation, once buried under ridicule, now stood unshakable. The eccentric general who refused to give up had changed the face of modern warfare. And though history would remember the beaches and the bravery, it would owe just as much to the mind that dared to imagine what others called impossible. In the years after the war, Percy Hobart returned quietly to civilian life. There were no parades, no medals pinned on public stages. He preferred it that way. He had always believed that real victories weren't won by glory, but by grit, imagination, and the courage to try something absurd when the world demanded the ordinary. But his legacy didn't fade. Every modern army that came after him would carry a piece of his vision. In Korea, engineers used armored bridge layers descended from his ark. In Vietnam, flail tanks, direct descendants of the Crab, beat the jungle roads clear of hidden mines. And decades later, in the deserts of Iraq and Afghanistan, soldiers still watched the ground tremble under the rhythm of chains hammering the earth. The same sound that once echoed across Normandy's beaches. Whoomp, whoomp, whoomp. The heartbeat of Hobart's idea. Military historians would call him the father of armored engineering. But that title misses the truth. Hobart wasn't just an engineer. He was a believer in people, in creativity, in the notion that intelligence could win wars as surely as courage. Even today, when modern tanks breach minefields with precision-guided systems and laser sensors, their DNA traces back to a man with a sketchbook, a workshop full of misfits, and an idea so mad it made sense. Somewhere in an archive, there's a photo of Hobart standing beside one of his crabs, arms crossed, eyes half smiling, chains hanging motionless in the air. The caption simply reads, "Percy Hobart, inventor, 79th Armored Division." But history knows better. When the beaches of Normandy were locked behind steel, wire, and mines, it wasn't brute force that broke them open. It was imagination. And it came from a man everyone once called a fool. They laughed at his toys. They mocked his machines. But in the end, his toys won the war. They laughed at the Crab, until Hobarts Funnies cleared 30 minefields in a day. They laughed at his toy tanks, until they won the war. In June 1944, the Allies faced the deadliest obstacle of World War II. Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Barbed wire, concrete bunkers, and millions of landmines stood between freedom and annihilation. But one man, a forgotten British engineer named Percy Hobart, had a plan so bizarre that even Churchill called it madness. They laughed at his inventions. They mocked his spinning chains, flamethrower tanks, and folding bridges. Soldiers called them Hobarts Funnies. But when D-Day came, those same machines did what brute force never could. This is the true story of the Sherman Crab, the mine-flail tank that cleared 30 minefields in a single day and opened the gates to Normandy. It's the story of the man who was once court-martialed and humiliated, and how his toy tanks saved thousands of lives. From rejection to redemption, from laughter to victory. This is how a handful of eccentric engineers changed history, proving that imagination can be deadlier than any gun.